talking about Obamacare in general and specifically the repeal of Obamacare today. Our guest visits with us by telephone from the West Coast. He is Josh Blackman, author of a newly published book, the title of which is Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power. First of all, Josh Blackman, nice to meet you. Nice to have you with us for a few minutes here today on the program.
Thank you for having me.
And for folks who are joining us a little bit late on this segment of It's Your Turn, my name is Dave Malarkey, and nice to have you with us. It looks like, a dead certainty that Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act is going to be repealed in light of the presidential election this last November. Isn't that the case, Mr. Blackman?
Absolutely. The Affordable Care Act has been more or less under constant attack by conservatives since it was enacted in 2010. It's important to remember that when President Obama first enacted it, not a single Republican in Congress backed it. And to this day, not a single Republican in Congress backs it. So now with control of the presidency, the House, and the Senate, the Republicans now have their opportunity to try to dismantle, or as I say, unravel the entire law.
So what will be the procedure? It's actually going to be quite a bit more complicated than most people might think, correct?
Yes, it's actually surprisingly complicated. The first thing your listeners have to keep in mind is that it generally takes 60 votes to do anything big in the Senate because of the filibuster. You always need 60 votes to get over the filibuster in the Senate. But Obamacare was passed with something special called budget reconciliation. And what that means is only 51 votes are needed to get rid of it. For certain budgetary matters, the filibuster simply doesn't apply. So as long as the Republicans can keep their Obamacare repeal within this framework of budget reconciliation, they don't need a single Democrat to repeal huge portions of the law. They can actually get rid of most of it with a straight party line vote. And
the division in the Senate, if I recall my numbers correctly, is 52 to 48. Is that right, in favor of the GOP?
I think that's about right. And then you always have a couple moderate Republicans who could flip one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. So let's assume that it is repealed, which seems to be pretty much a definite guarantee. Will it have to be replaced with something else, sir?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? As of the present moment, Republicans are planning on this strategy called repeal and delay. And what that means is they vote this year to repeal it, but they put a delay on it. So it won't actually go away until 2018, 2019, exactly when's unclear. And the hope, the sincere hope, is that once they gut it and get rid of it in those intervening 2 or 3 years, they can come up with something much better. But I'm sure your listeners are aware the strategy is a risky one because every day that the Republicans are in power, pressure builds to cave. And if they decide to gut it and repeal large portions of it, there might be pressure to come up with something that maybe is even worse than Obamacare. And maybe they won't be able to come up with anything at all. So Republicans have to be aware that they will now be responsible for health insurance once they decide to repeal Obamacare.
Does it just take one vote, does it? Can you repeal it in pieces? Is that what they'll do with a series of votes, or is it just going to be one vote right away, but that doesn't take effect for X number of years?
So the strategy that Republicans are talking about now is basically one vote now, which kills a lot of it, and probably another vote in April, May that kills more of it. And the hope is that in 2-3 years they can repeal anything that's left over and replace it with something else. So it'll probably take several votes. The initial vote we'll probably see maybe even this month, it could be in the next couple of weeks, is the reconciliation bill. And that uses this process of needing only 51 votes to repeal huge portions of the ACA that affect the budget, right? So long as this affects budget, you can repeal it. I mean, frankly, the entire ACA, all of Obamacare, affects the budget because it's so damn expensive. But this can get rid of things like the individual mandate, which is what requires people to buy insurance. It can get rid of various taxes under the law, various penalties for employers who don't insure their workers. So they can really gut core portions of the law, but they can't quite get rid of all of it unless they get creative.
We're chatting, listeners, if you've joined us a little bit late on this segment of It's Your Turn, welcome. Josh Blackman is our guest. He visits with us by telephone. Mr. Blackman is an associate professor of law at South Texas College of Law, who specializes in constitutional law and the U.S. Supreme Court, among other things. I'm going to talk with him a little bit about the vacancy on the Supreme Court in just a couple of minutes. But we're talking about what looks like the almost certain repeal of the Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare. You mentioned earlier, Mr. Blackman, that not a single Republican supported the Affordable Care Act when it was passed several years ago. There are some who suggest that that was a political move more than anything else, that, well, given the comments of Mitch McConnell, the majority leader of the Senate at the time of Obama's election, he made those famous comments, well, we're going to do everything we can do to make sure he doesn't get a second term and that none of his proposals are going to be approved. What do you have to say about that? Was the fact that no Republican voted for it at all partly political?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that bit about McConnell. The timing of that isn't quite right. McConnell said that about a week or two before the midterm election in 2010. He didn't say it when Obama was elected. He said it about 2 years later. And the context in which you said it was about Obamacare. This was after the president had decided to ram through Obamacare in a straight party-line vote. And McConnell said, well, if this is how you want to govern, then we're not interested in having you as the president a second time. There was efforts by the president to get Republicans to come on board with the Affordable Care Act, and those efforts didn't go anywhere, in part because Republicans had no interest in putting the federal government in charge of health insurance. And the second part was they simply didn't like the president's proposals, and whether they could or couldn't have, I think it's a legitimate policy question. The fact of the matter is, once Republicans said, we're not signing off on this, and the president says, I don't care, I'm going to do this with Democrats only, that was a momentous decision because that made this a purely political issue. Don't get me wrong, health insurance is something that's important. It affects everyone in Pittsburgh and Butler and everywhere you happen to be. But now health insurance has become such a partisan issue that really divides people. I should note, actually, I lived in Johnstown for 2 years. I clerked for a judge there, so I'm very familiar with your market.
Excellent. One other question about this, and I will be very blunt with you up front. I am certainly not particularly well read on the intricacies of the Affordable Care Act. I know a good bit about it in general. But I did read in a Wire story some years ago that, I don't know whether this is true or not, that the plan that eventually was agreed upon, in other words, requiring people to buy insurance from private companies as opposed to a universal health care approach paid for by the federal government, that the plan to use insurance companies was actually first formulated by and promulgated by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. Is that true or not?
It's true in part. So back in the 80s, when Democrats were starting to bubble up support for national health care, an economist at Heritage, a guy named Stuart Butler, came up with a proposal saying, well, instead of having a national health care, let's have a government requirement to buy a form of kind of like emergency catastrophic insurance. That way, if someone gets hit by a bus, they won't have to put the bill onto the government. And that idea floated around for years, and Mitt Romney, when he was governor of Massachusetts, actually implemented that. Ted Kennedy and Jonathan Gruber and others helped Mitt Romney implement Romneycare. And Romneycare was, in many respects, a precursor of Obamacare. The difference, of course, not that people cared, but the big difference is here you have a single state implementing it by itself versus a top-down solution with the federal government is mandating on all 50 states. And that's actually a fairly big deal from a constitutional perspective, but something that most people don't really notice the difference about. But indeed, the idea of a mandate was viewed as an alternative to a European single-payer style approach to health insurance.
Well, what turned conservatives and Republicans against that then, if it was originally favored by the Heritage Foundation?
Probably Obama. I don't want to say that too lightly, but I think there was a strong opposition to this because it was coming from a Democratic president. I'll give it some of a charitable defense because the Republicans at the time weren't focused on health care. That simply wasn't the issue their constituents wanted. They were focusing on the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the economy, the mortgage crisis meltdown. There were a lot of issues ahead of the pack, and Republicans simply did not want to put the government in charge of health insurance. So even if some conservatives in Massachusetts, which is not a particularly conservative state, but even if some Republicans in Massachusetts back this, I don't think it's quite a fair argument to say that all Republicans in all 50 states would suddenly jump behind this idea.
Folks, I want to save some time because I have another important topic that I want to discuss with our guest, Josh Blackman, and that is the vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court. Mr. Blackman is the author of a new book entitled Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power, and we'll pick up our conversation with him on It's Your Turn on WISR right after these words.
There was never anyone in my family who had breast cancer, so I didn't see any reason why I would get it now.
The imaging showed that Joanne had bilateral breast cancer.
I was really worried, but I could tell that Dr. Maloof and his team really cared.
Led by Dr. Tony Maloof, Butler Health System's highly skilled surgical team got to work.
Bilateral mastectomy is as complicated as breast cancer surgery can be. With our experienced pathologists and advancement in imaging, we can make a precise diagnosis.
Once I chose the surgery, they were able to schedule it right away. It was a miracle when I came out of surgery and I didn't need either chemo or radiation. The attention and compassion that I received from Dr. Maloof and his team was truly remarkable.
Visit remarkablebhs.org to learn more about our surgery services. Butler Health System. Caring hands, remarkable minds.
Welcome back, listeners. Joining us a little bit late on It's Your Turn today. Welcome. My name is Dave Malarkey. Our guest visits with us by telephone. Josh Blackman is Associate Professor of Law at the South Texas College of Law. And for the purposes of our discussion today, the author of a new book entitled Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power. Let's turn, Professor Blackman, to the vacancy on the Supreme Court with the death. And gosh, it's nearly a year ago now, isn't it? The sudden and unexpected death of Antonin Scalia.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's a year. He passed away suddenly. It was February of 2016. So strikingly, we're at a very, almost very eerie anniversary. And officially, as of January 3rd, so just the other day, President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland expired. No action has to be taken, but at the end of one Congress, the beginning of another, all nominations that haven't been confirmed are expired. So this vacancy is now Donald Trump's to fill. And
is there any insight? Do you have any inside knowledge on who he's going to nominate?
Oh, I couldn't tell you anything more than I read. But Donald Trump did do something that was unprecedented, and I think, frankly, refreshing, in that he released a list, two lists actually, of individuals he would consider putting on the high court. The first list, I think, had 11 names. The second list had, I think, another 10 names. And these are all judges, for the most part, all but one, who are in either federal courts or in state courts. And he said these are the people that he would limit his search to. And actually, for your listeners, there's one judge who's based in Pittsburgh. His name is Thomas Hardiman. He was an appointment by George W. Bush to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. Before that, he was actually a federal trial judge, also in Pittsburgh. And so he's one of your local natives who's on the short list.
As I understand it, there's no requirement constitutionally that it has to be even a judge. Could Trump surprise us with a name that nobody even thought of?
Well, the only non-judge who was on the list was Senator Mike Lee of Utah. Indeed, there's no requirement to be a judge. There's no requirement to even be a lawyer. You could appoint anyone to the Supreme Court. It might not be the best idea, but you can. Although Mike Lee was a former Supreme Court law clerk, so he knows his stuff. But Trump has promised several times, whatever that's worth, I don't know, but Trump has promised several times that he would only pick for his selection someone from those lists. So we have at least somewhat of a guarantee that we'll know who it's going to be within the realm of possibilities. It won't be some, wild card like putting Omarosa in the Supreme Court or something. I don't think that's in the cards.
Given the fact that it is indeed almost a year since the unexpected death of Scalia, do you think that this is going to be fast-tracked? Is this going to be one of the first things?
No. Payback, my friend, payback. The Democrats are looking for severe payback for the way that Merrick Garland was blocked. They are looking for payback. In fact, Senator Schumer, who's now the majority leader that Harry Reid has stepped down, Schumer has effectively said that we will try and keep the seat open, and however long it takes. And so they'll try and keep the seat open for another 4 years. I mean, Schumer's test is basically, is this something we would support? So if Donald Trump nominates a Democrat for the Supreme Court, great. But if he nominates a conservative, then I think we're going to have a serious battle. The thing that your listeners have to keep in mind is that traditionally, judicial nominees, you needed 60 votes to get them through. Mm-hmm. But in 2013, Harry Reid eliminated the filibuster for the lower courts, the trial courts and the courts of appeals. But he conveniently left in place a filibuster for the Supreme Court. If the Democrats filibuster Trump's nominee, I expect the Republicans to get rid of the filibuster for the Supreme Court altogether, and that lets basically 51 votes decide the Supreme Court issue. And that, I think, will be a very significant change in the process, but will be the next step in this sort of downward spiral of how nominations have become so contentious.
So this is not a requirement of the United States Constitution, but merely a Senate rule that could be changed?
Exactly. The Constitution says basically majority support. Mm-hmm. But as a matter of tradition, the Senate gives this power to filibuster to allow debate. I mean, that's what it's designed to allow people to debate. But in practice, it becomes, you don't have Mr. Smith goes to Washington. They're not staying up there for 24 hours straight. They're simply sitting there saying, we don't want to vote unless you get to 60, the vote never happens. So the Republicans will say, okay, fine, we'll actually make you stand up here for 24 hours, and when you sit down, we'll vote. And that might be the way to simply get rid of this procedural hold.
I read a Wire story recently that said, actually, it's not the first nomination of Donald Trump to the Supreme Court that's important. It would be the second one, which could be expected actually rather soon, given the age of particularly some of the more liberal justices. Because let's assume that he nominates a conservative to fill Scalia's spot, which is going to happen, and that person is approved. That merely restores the court to what it was with Antonin Scalia, which is conservative-leaning. But with a second appointment that could come up, particularly with Ruth Bader Ginsburg or one of the others, that could really swing the court totally conservative. So they say the one you really want to look at is Trump's second nominee.
Right. So, I mean, this nomination would more or less swap Scalia with another conservative. So in that sense, it more or less keeps the dynamics in place. But don't think it'll be anything less than a fight. Mm-hmm. The next one, whether it's Justice Kennedy, Justice Ginsburg, that's ground zero, because it's only happened very rarely in the last, decades that a Republican president replaced a Democrat nominee. It doesn't happen very often. This is fascinating. Justices tend to time their retirement so that a president of their own party can appoint the replacement. Occasionally, someone dies or gets sick and can't make it through, which is what happened with Justices Brennan and Thurgood Marshall, who died when George H.W. Bush was president. But that's the outlier. Most of the time, Justice Souter, who's a liberal, Justice Stevens, who's liberal, waited, and as soon as Barack Obama was inaugurated, they stepped out. But if something happens to Justice Ginsburg or maybe Justice Kennedy, that will change the court dramatically. And that was not what people were expecting. They thought Hillary Clinton would win. They thought Pennsylvania would go for Hillary, and then there'd be a done deal. And my friends in Western Pennsylvania perhaps had other ideas.
Let me ask you one more question. Our time begins to run short here, but I do want to. Part of the title of your new book is Executive Power. And what do you discuss along those lines in the book, Professor Blackman?
So during the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, President Obama turned to executive action and executive orders and other things to stop enforcing the law. So, for example, some of the provisions of the law require people to buy very expensive insurance. And for a lot of people, they simply couldn't afford it. So instead of, going to Congress and saying, hey, maybe you should tweak what the law says, the president says, you know what, I'm simply not going to enforce this. If you decide not to buy a new, shiny insurance plan, I won't penalize you. And that might sound great to people, like, yay, I don't have to pay a penalty. But the president has a duty to faithfully execute the law. And he can't decide to pick and choose which laws he'll enforce and which he'll simply disregard. And so his use of executive power was illegal and I think quite dangerous. So we'll be seeing, hopefully, that wind down, although I suspect and fear that the next president may simply reinitiate it under a different form. So it may not go away altogether.
The religious liberty issue has also been big, and if you probably know, here in western Pennsylvania, with regard to a requirement that a group of nuns in a religious order offer a birth control through the Affordable Care Act. In fact, the Catholic bishop of the Pittsburgh diocese, Zubik, his name is on the title of the issue as it went to the Supreme Court.
You stole my line. I was going to go to Zubik. Yeah, Mr. Zubik was the lead named plaintiff in the Supreme Court's decision, and this was whether various religious charities can be required to not pay for, but have a birth control offered on their insurance plan. It's either the government or the insurance company pays for it. The Supreme Court was not able to resolve that issue with only 8 justices, so they kind of punted it. And now this issue will fall to the Trump administration to work at a settlement or negotiation with the diocese, and hopefully they can figure something out because the Obama administration was not willing to budge on this question.
The title of Professor Blackman's book, listeners, is Unraveled: Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power. Available, I assume, Professor, wherever we find books these days?
Amazon's the best place, or my blog, joshblackman.com.
Thanks, Professor. Nice to talk with you today. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.
We'll be chatting with our next guest.